Is Wizards of the Coast 2014 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons actually Dungeons and Dragons, or is it something new and different? Let's get into it. What's up, nerdlings, podlings, my fellow spooky friends? It is October the 19th. It is 10:27 a.m. in the morning here at well, it was foggy, and now it's bright and sunny, and I can tell you it's bright and sunny because the headache is starting. Oh, yes, move to a beach town. It's the best place to live for your migraines. No, it's not. It's literally the worst possible place to live if you have repetitive tension migraine syndrome like I do. No, you don't care. But hey, when in doubt, talk about the weather. So a couple days ago, I posted a video responding to Jeremy Crawford's very weird interview comments, insight into Planescape and the future of 2024 through 2027 D&D. And in it, I repeatedly made a statement that I often make. 5th edition D&D is not Dungeons and Dragons. I've said this before, and I'll say it again, which is weird because I also often say, yes, it is D&D. And for the first time in a long time, people called me out on it. What are you talking about? It is D&D. I've been playing it for 2 years. If I haven't been playing D&D, what have I been playing? Candyland? So let's get into why I say it's not Dungeons and Dragons anymore. Okay, first and foremost, I love 5th edition. I guess now I have to refer to it as 5th edition 2014. I loved playing 5th edition 2014. I finished a year-long 5th edition 2014 D&D campaign December of last year. It was great fun. It was a Call of the Netherdeep campaign, so you can't get more deep into the 5e jungle than that. I've enjoyed running it. I've enjoyed playing it. But the games I've enjoyed running and playing the most using that system are the ones where people are like, yeah, it's not D&D. Let's try and not try and make it D&D. Let's just embrace what it is. So it's not D&D. But then I don't think Castles and Crusades is D&D either. And I don't think any one of the 7,000, 5,000, 7,000 OGL OSR retro clones are 100% Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, Gygaxian Dungeons and Dragons versus Dungeons and Dragons today, and we can 100% agree that 5th edition 2014 Dungeons and Dragons is not Gygaxian Dungeons and Dragons anymore. And Wizards of the Coast wants you to completely forget anything having to do with the past. Jeremy Crawford has said so on multiple occasions that nothing that was created before 2014 counts. And in his weird mindset, unless he does it for 2024 D&D, it's never been done before. He's literally said, it's the first time ever you've been able to do this in D&D. I was like, no, it isn't, but okay. So is 2014 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons? Yes, it is. Hasbro owns that word. Hasbro can call anything they want Dungeons and Dragons. As I jokingly say all the time, they could call this sandwich Dungeons and Dragons if they wanted to, and it would be Dungeons and Dragons. So yes, it is Dungeons and Dragons. It says so right there on the cover. D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeon Master's Guide, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Now referred to, of course, by Jeremy Crawford as 2014 through 2024 Dungeons and Dragons. So yes, it is. It is still Dungeons and Dragons. In regards to the argument about the wussification of Dungeons and Dragons and how the system became more wussy over time, and I argued, no, it's still D&D. Is it still Dungeons and Dragons? The mechanics haven't changed that much. They're still the same basic stuff that Gary and Dave and the others came up with 50 years ago. Roll dice, stuff happens. And for some reason, we chose the 20-sider, which didn't exist at the time. They then had to go out and make 20-siders, but yeah. So that hasn't changed. Armor class, hit points, strength, dex, con, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. That hasn't changed. Fighter, cleric, magic user, thief as the core 4. That hasn't changed. That is still Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, the system is not more or less wussy now than it was yesterday or 50 years ago. It has evolved. It has changed. It is designed to embrace a larger audience, but the basic mechanics are still the same. Roll dice, stuff happens. So yes, it is still D&D. Yes, Wizards of the Coast can still call it D&D. Yes, when we sit down, when we say we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, it's still sort of agreed upon what we are playing, right? So yes, it is still D&D. And it is no more or less wussy than it was before. It is not really that different. Sure, there's new things, but you can choose to ignore them. If we could embrace the Jeremy Crawford unusual logic as a defense, or we could ignore it. But for the most part, 5th edition, 2014 Wizards of the Coast D20 Fantasy is D&D because Wizards of the Coast Hasbro says it is. Is it not D&D? It is also not Dungeons and Dragons. And it stopped being Dungeons and Dragons around 3.54. Some people will argue it stopped being Dungeons and Dragons with 2nd edition AD&D when they started adding all the splat books and the changing the math and changing the mechanics and trying to address a larger, more normal audience. You know, there are people out there who will say 2nd edition AD&D is when it stopped being D&D and became something else. There are people who say, no, when Wizards of the Coast bought it and released 3rd edition, it became something completely different, and that's when it stopped being D&D. I would say no, 3rd edition pretty much was just the logical next step of 2nd edition AD&D. You know, it probably is close to what Gygax wanted, because if you look at the stuff he wrote for Legendary Journeys and Mythos and Castles and Crusades, it's pretty similar. You know, they added the skills and they added the more classes and they started adding the splat books, but 3 was pretty much D&D. 3.5 is kind of when it stopped being about Dungeons and Dragons and started being about money. The mechanics are the same. The world is still the same. It's still D&D, but, you know, they discovered a editing mistake. Well, a couple editing mistakes. I forget how many. But basically, they discovered a mistake. Now, there's 2 ways Wizards of the Coast could have approached that mistake. The right way and the Wizards of the Coast way. The right way would have been, hey, there's some mistakes. We're going to make an errata available for you guys for free or for, you know, $10 or whatever. And this errata will fix the mistakes that were in 3. Well, it's not what they did. They released a brand new player's handbook, a brand new monster manual, a brand new dungeon master, and they started making brand new adventures. Some of them were reprints of adventures they already made. And while the party line at the beginning was, there's no difference, it was definitely insinuated, especially to game stores, we're not going to support 3 anymore. We're supporting 3.5. This is also about the time that the whole OGL thing started. We're not going to get into that because then we'd be talking for a couple hours. So 3.5 is kind of when D&D stopped being D&D because the direction of the game changed, the mechanics started to change, and the philosophy of the company in charge of D&D started to change, and we started seeing the difference of players. D&D became more open, more accepting, more and more people were playing D&D. You encountered it more in the wild, because I love just saying encountering it in the wild. Not that it means anything, but I just love saying that. I encountered D&D in the wild yesterday. What does that mean? Nothing. I saw it at a bookstore, but it just sounds cooler when I say I encountered D&D in the wild. So D&D was evolving. It was changing. It was no longer Gygaxian D&D. We had the OGL. We had all these other games coming out claiming to recapture D&D, and this is what D&D was supposed to be, and this is Gygaxian D&D. And then we had 4th. And 4th is when it officially 100% stopped being Dungeons and Dragons. It stopped emulating the philosophy and the mentality and the play style of Dungeons and Dragons. It was geared towards a completely different audience. It had completely jarringly different mechanics that we were unprepared for. And the philosophy of the company in charge of D&D changed, as did the target audience. This is also the first case of Wizards of the Coast not knowing who their target was. And this was the kernel of the way we were going to see Wizards of the Coast treat its fan base and retailers. Without going into too deep into 4E, because that would be a completely separate video, I think it's safe to say, in regards to 4E, from day one, when they first announced it, all the way up to when they just sort of abandoned it, Every single possible choice Wizards of the Coast made involving 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons was wrong. Wrong to the point that it spun up a visceral level of hate that is just mind-boggling, and it's still out there. There are still people who hate 4th edition, and I'm not talking, I hate 4th edition the same way, like, oh, I hate the lineup for the sports team, or oh, I hate that they replaced that character, or oh, I hate fish. No, it's not that kind of hate. It is, I will motherfucking kill you if you, in the dark, and wear your skin as a suit if you so much as talk about 4th edition in a positive way. There are you kicked my dog levels of hate. There are jihad levels of hate for 4th edition. People fucking hate 4E still. And that definitely makes it not D&D, because while D&D in the past definitely had edition wars, it was never us versus us. It was always, outsiders attacking D&D players, and D&D players trying to get more outsiders to embrace us and hang out with us. We wanted you to hang out with us. 4th edition became very much the few 4th edition players versus the other players. And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that I saw at least 2 fistfights. Nonstop, police had to be called, fistfights break out over 4th edition. And I know one guy who tried to kill a guy because of 4th edition. That is how much hate 4th edition started. That is how gratingly it wasn't D&D. Now, I love the mechanics of 4E. 4E is great. The way the mechanics were presented, I mean, if you look at the 4E Player's Handbook, they're a fucking mess. It could have been done much better. I mean, if I showed a 4E Player's Handbook to somebody who'd never played D&D, they'd be unbelievably confused. And if I showed a 4E Player's Handbook to somebody who'd played 3.5, they would also be like, what the fuck is this mess? This looks nothing like Dungeons and Dragons. This isn't Dungeons and Dragons. What it should have been is Eberron, the role-playing game. That's what they should have been. I've said that before. People have argued with me that Eberron was already out. And I was like, no, Eberron was still new enough that they could have re-released it and said, this is the Eberron role-playing game system, since that's the audience they were going for. They were trying to go for the World of Warcraft audience. They were trying to go for the Eberron audience. So they were trying to go for the steampunk audience. They were trying to go for the computer generation audience. Anybody remember Diablo, the Diablo role-playing game that they put out, which was supposed to be what 4th edition, 3rd edition was going to be, but then they put out something completely different, and then they put out 4th? Everything they did with 4th was wrong, and that is probably the demarcation line of when it stopped being D&D. The mechanics were completely jarringly different than what we were used to. The layout was different. The philosophy was different, and what they believed the target audience was different. And Wizards of the Coast did nothing to alleviate the jarring war that they caused. In fact, they did really much nothing whatsoever with 4th edition. They kind of just threw 4th edition to the sharks and then sort of abandoned it. There's hardly any Wizards of the Coast product for 4E, and there's almost no third-party product for 4E. And then 4E just kind of disappeared, at which point they released 5th edition, or as Jeremy Crawford calls it, 2014 Wizards of the Coast 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So again, there is a jarring line. And again, the mechanics of 5th edition are completely different than 4th. I mean, they're still the same mechanics. It's not any more or less wussy. It's still roll dice, stuff happens. But it's also completely different. Hi, Pew Professional. Hopefully you've liked, shared, and subscribed. 5e is not D&D. No, it's not. Now, 5e's target audience was not the same as 4e or 3e. I was not the target audience of 5e. While they did make some token acknowledgments, if you look at the 5e Player's Handbook, it looks a lot closer to the 3 Player's Handbook as it does to the 4 Player's Handbook. 4 was just set out there, and after, whatever was it, 3 years, and just sort of, you're on your island now, 4th. You have the 5 people who still play you. We're not going to support you. But, whatever, you're still out there. And there's still people out there today who say 4th is great. They love 4th. They love playing 4th. And they're all about 4th. And people are like, whatever, I'm there. You notice 4th was never mentioned in the January OGL thing. So then we get to 5th, 2014 5th. By saying it's 2014 5th edition, again, you're saying it's not the same game. And sure, it is D&D, but the philosophy has changed, the mechanics have changed, and the target audience has changed, and it doesn't embrace the mechanics of what D&D should be. Probably, especially according to Crawford, 5th edition should have been Planescape, because according to Crawford, it always was Planescape. But more importantly, it probably should have started with Spelljammer as the core rules, and should have been said, this is the Spelljammer role-playing game. This is the Planescape role-playing game that just happens to be using an engine that you're familiar with. Okay, but they didn't. And every choice they made regarding 5th edition 2014 D&D was so badly done, up to and including, of course, everything that they've done this year. Again, shows that Wizards of the Coast doesn't know what they're doing. It doesn't know who their target audience is, and it's not D&D. The mechanics are not D&D, but more importantly, the philosophy of the game is no longer Dungeons & Dragons. It doesn't embrace that sword and sorcery, classic fantasy, sandals and swords, Conan the Barbarian, Middle-earth, King Arthur, okay? That was Dungeons & Dragons, and it stopped being that 3.5, but basically 4th. The play style went from Middle-earth, King Arthur, Conan the Barbarian, sword and sorcery, to Eberron / World of Warcraft. The play style was jarringly different. It was no longer D&D. It was 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which should have been Eberron the role-playing game or something similar. Should not have been D&D. It should have started with Eberron, and then after a year said, hey, do you like this system? If you do, we're going to use it for D&D going forward. I've talked about that in separate videos, and I will again. But it wasn't D&D, because it wasn't designed to emulate the sword and sorcery style of D&D. It was designed to emulate a different play style, a different mechanic, a different thought pattern. It stopped being Dungeons & Dragons. 5th edition is geared for a completely different style to play. 5th edition, the engine, which I absolutely love, is very much over the top. It's very much Saturday morning cartoon. It's very much, I take a 20-minute break, eat a sandwich, and I'm healed. That's not D&D. That's not Conan the Barbarian. That's not Sword and Sorcery. That's a Saturday morning cartoon. That's a video game. It should have been designed to emulate that mechanic. That mechanic, that philosophy is not D&D. It's not Sword and Sorcery. It's not Conan the Barbarian. It's not Middle-earth. It's not King Arthur. It's a new style of play. It's a new mechanical style of play, and it embraces more of a over-the-top Saturday morning cartoon style of play. Spelljammer is the perfect setting for the mechanics of 5e. Planescape, maybe, I don't know, I'm still kind of confused on Planescape. But yes, if you look at some of the 5e adjacent products that have come out, like the Iron Kingdoms and some of the other ones that I have said, these are perfect settings for the 5e engine. D&D play style is not the perfect setting for the 5e engine. If you try to emulate the D&D play style, sword and sorcery, Conan, low power, human-centric, damage, dark, grim damage, all the stuff people say we played in the 80s, but we know we never did. The wussification, the coddling of the players. If you try and force the D&D playstyle into 5e, it doesn't work. And every 5e game I have seen that tried to be that failed. It is only the games that embraced the ridiculousness of the 5e engines that I were in that succeed. And if you listen to what Crawford is saying in these videos, he's trying to sort of kind of telling you the same thing. It's not D&D anymore. It's Planescape. It always was Planescape. And going forward, 2024 D&D will be completely different, even though it's backwards compatible, but we're not acknowledging any of the previous things. And it's going to be Planescape. It's going to be Planescape centric, at least as of today. That was Crawford is saying. He's saying it's not D&D anymore, which is fine. You can call it D&D. Sure, we can call anything we want D&D. It's D&D in name only. It is a completely different style of play. And that's okay as long as you embrace that style of play. But if you try and backwards it into a D&D style of play, or even further, the OGL OSR style of play, it doesn't work. It's not D&D. I got to go to a meeting. I just got a text, so I got to wrap this up real quick, guys. So in closing, yes, Yes, it is Dungeons and Dragons, because Wizards of the Coast can call whatever they want Dungeons and Dragons. They can call my cup of coffee Dungeons and Dragons if they want to. The branding of D&D is still D&D. The basic mechanics are still D&D. Strength, Dex, Con, Intelligence, Wisdom, Charisma, Armor class, hit point, level, fighter, cleric, wizard, thief. That is still Dungeons and Dragons. That core roll dice stuff happens is still there. It is not D&D in that the philosophy has changed, the play style has changed, the mechanics has changed. The basic, the way Wizards of the Coast treats the game and the customer base has definitely changed. What they're trying to do with 2014 D&D has changed. And now they're changing it again with 2024 D&D. And they are pretty much telling us everything before 2024 doesn't really matter. We're starting all over. It's a soft reset, but it's going to be backwards compatible. Well, no, it's not. You can't say it's a soft reset and we're starting all over and also say it's backwards compatible. It is, for all intents and purpose, kind of a new game. And it's not going to be the 5e we know. They've said so. And it's not going to be 4e, because poor 4e, that's a whole separate subject, which I'll probably have to get into now, is still on its island going, I'm still here. I'm still cool. And it's definitely not 3, 2, 1. It's definitely not the OGL. It's definitely not the OSR. But I think it's safe to say, guys, I've lost my old school cred. It's its own beast. 5e is its own thing. 2014 through 2024 D&D is its own thing. It's not Dungeons and Dragons. It's a completely separate beast, and that's okay. And 2024 through 2027 D&D will be its own beast. It won't be D&D. It will be something completely different. Sure, they can call it D&D, but it's not going to be D&D, because that Gygaxian low sword and sorcery fantasy style of play only worked with when the rules were specifically built around that, and when the philosophy of the player base and the company behind it was trying to embrace that 60s, 70s, 80s pulp fantasy, as opposed to the 90s through 2010s video game fantasy, or now the Magic the Gathering video game multiverse style of play that 5e is. So if I offended you by saying 5e is not D&D, I'm sorry, but in my opinion, it's not. You can disagree with me. That's fine. We know I'm a fucking idiot, and I don't expect you to agree with me. As long as you're willing to have a reasonable conversation about the topic, that's fine. If you're going to throw shade at me and call me names, well, then I'll just embrace those names and use them as ammunition against you. At the end of the day, I'm an idiot. My opinion doesn't matter. This is why I say it's not D&D. You can agree with me like Pew Professional does, or you can disagree with me and say I'm a fucking moron. I don't know. I mean, whatever. I got to go because my ride is here. Sorry for cutting you guys short. We will continue this later today because I feel I now have to talk about 4E. Stay safe out there, and I'll talk to you all soon.